Hello historians, welcome to French history. So let's get started. Make sure you've got the worksheet either printed off to write on by hand or electronically. You're going to need sound for the clips. You're going to need 3 highlighter pens. You might want your Francine Revolution textbook. You might want a cup of tea. And I would recommend that you put your phone somewhere out of the way so it doesn't distract you from your learning. Okay, so today we're going to be carrying on with the work that we've been doing on the failure of constitutional monarchy. The big question is, why does constitutional monarchy ultimately fail when there have been such high hopes for it in the aftermath of the revolution, the early stages? So we're going to be thinking about what was the impact of the flight to Varennes on constitutional monarchy. So we've already started to think about this topic in terms of the popular opinions about the monarchy, but we're going to be thinking particularly today about political divisions within the assembly. And so we're going to be describing the divisions that emerge in the assembly in the wake of the flight to Varennes. We're going to be explaining how an event called the Champ de Mars was illustrative of the political balance of power, and we are going to evaluate where this balance of power lay between radicals and constitutional monarchists by mid-1791. Okay, so task 1 on your sheet, what I would like you to do is just have a little look at this contemporary pamphlet. Okay, so it was written right after the flight to Varennes. It's from a pamphlet called La Paire de Chesne. Okay, so La Paire de Chesne was a newspaper, one of the many newspapers on the sort of radical left-wing press that had emerged as a result of the breakdown of censorship in 1789. It was written by Jacques-René Hébert, who will come up a little bit later on as well. So it's worth, if you can see here, you've got a hyperlink and it's on the sheet as well. You might want to read the Alpha History page on Hébert. There's some information about what he goes on to do later on in the revolution, the more radical phase during the Terror. So he was the writer, the editor of this newspaper, which was only started in 1790 really, but carries on until about 1794. And it was called La Paire de Chesne after the character La Paire de Chesne, Old Man de Chesne, basically in French. And La Paire de Chesne was a fictional character who represented a man of the people. He was a very honest talking character. He used very earthy, plain language, and he was always moved, it is said, to denounce the abuses and the injustices of particularly the upper classes. So this newspaper was, became infamous in the revolution. Denouncements in this later on could mean that that person that had been denounced would be taken straight to the guillotine. And this newspaper, interestingly, was sometimes sold by street criers who would bring it out into the street and shout, "La Paire de Chesne is damn angry today." So it was published anytime Hébert had something often incendiary to say about the government or politics at the time. And it became the most popular newspaper in Paris and was instrumental in Hébert's rise to influence by 1793-94. Okay, so it's aimed at sans-culottes. We don't really know who they are yet, but we will know who they are. They're basically the working classes. And it says here as well that he changed his view. So before the flight to Varennes, he was very much in favour of the constitution and constitutional monarchy and working with the king. And afterwards, he changed his mind. And you can get the sense of that when you read this in a moment. So you've got a glossary here of some of the key words in the order that they're in the text. What I'd like you to do for a minute is pause the video, read it, and you can annotate it on your worksheet as well. So we're practicing our source skills here. And can you just write down what you can learn from it in terms of the content? What's the message? What's he saying? And what can you learn from the emphasis and the tone? So you might want to pick out 2 or 3 or even 4 kind of key phrases that you think shows something about the real kind of beliefs and feelings that are going on here that's useful or valuable to the historian. And what can you learn from the provenance? Okay, so pause the video, read it through, annotate and write down your answers to those 3 questions, and then we'll go through some suggested answers in a minute. Okay, so some suggested answers on that. Now, obviously, in terms of the content, we can say that clearly the content is in favour of republicanism. And, you know, that does very much link to the provenance, doesn't it? Because we said a minute ago in the provenance, we were talking about Ebert, that he before this had been in favour of the constitution, and now you can see from the first line, you are no longer my king, no longer my king. That is clearly a statement of republicanism, isn't it? You know, he's even talking later on about you're going to have your head on a scaffold. So it illustrates very, very clearly how the attitudes towards the monarchy had changed as a result of the monarchy's betrayal in attempting to flee to Austria. We can link this in with some of the language that links in with the tone and the emphasis. So he's called a deserter, he's a coward, used several times. So it's accusational, isn't it? Accusatory oral language that has been used here. He's a perjurer, so he has lied. He's a coward and a liar. So lots of outrage. That's another word we could use for the tone. It's an outraged tone. It's at how Louis has betrayed the people. You know, there's lots of language of death in here, isn't there? There's the scaffold, the executioner. He is going to be walled up. They're going to stuff you in an asylum, and then he's going to be stuffed with an axe. So the emphasis is very much on finality, on physical attack, on even death, isn't it? It's very much looking forward to the future events. So you can see that attitudes have really soured, and they've really become personal, and not just personal against Louis, but this referenced here to Messalina, the third wife of Roman Emperor Claudius, who plotted against him and was executed. This is, you know, a clear reference to Marie Antoinette, and, you know, the continued hatred of her influence over Louis, having supposedly convinced him to do this, the influence of her links with the Austrians. That is, you know, that attitude towards Marie Antoinette again have hardened, as we can see from this source. And in terms of the provenance, like I said, you know, this is valuable because it shows how the popular attitudes were changing, doesn't it? So it shows that, you know, this had a really wide readership. It was the most popular newspaper at the time. This was clearly going to influence the working classes, the sans-culottes, wasn't it? This was inciting them to reject the monarchy, and, you know, calling them to rise up and to take further action and bring down this constitution, which did still feature this particular king at its heart. So, you know, we could also point here to the fact that it was published directly after the flight to Varennes. So it shows that, you know, that this event was a turning point in attitudes, like we've said before. Good. So coming on to that idea that the flight to Varennes was a turning point in attitudes, we read this quote in the work I think we said last week. The flight to Varennes opened up a second great schism of the revolution. The first one, I think, being when in the Estates General, when not all of the estates agreed on the National Assembly. There had been hardly any republicanism in 1789, and what there had been abated had been abated once the king was back in Paris and accepting all the assembly sent to him. But after Varennes, the mistrust built up by his long record of apparent ambivalence burst out into widespread demands from the populace of the capital and a number of radical publicists for the king to be dethroned. So that's just, you know, him talking about this, why this was a turning point and how this is going to have repercussions in the long term. And this is a key idea, this idea that the revolution is becoming fractured. Okay, so we're no longer talking about a unified group of revolutionaries against the monarchy. It is increasingly some of the revolutionaries want to keep the monarchy, the more moderates. Others want to remove it altogether, and that's crucial in understanding why the revolution enters this more kind of radical phase as we go into 1792-93. Okay, so we're going to annotate a diagram now to illustrate these political divisions that exist in France. So you've got this on the second page of your worksheet, and all I want you to do for this task is copy from this video. So the first thing that you can copy down, and you might want to colour in 3 colours like I asked you to get earlier if you've got them, because this represents the alliances that are being made within the assembly and with other groups on the outside of the assembly. So you can see here I've divided the assembly into a half moon kind of shape. Okay, and we've talked before about how the terms left wing and right wing came about as a result of the revolution. So you had on the left wing those in favour increasingly of putting the king on trial, of removing him from the constitution, and you had on the right wing constitutional monarchists, people that wanted to keep the monarchy as a fundamental part of the constitution in France. But you also have a sort of middle ground. This is not party politics, this is political clubs, and it can be confusing sometimes because people seem to be in several clubs. Danton is in the Cordeliers, he was one of the founders. He also goes to the Jacobin Club. Lafayette, in a minute we're going to say he's in the Feuillants, which we'll talk about who they are, but he was also in the La Société d'État. So it's not as if people have allegiance to one party and everybody's allegiances and the view of each of these political clubs tends to change, fairly amorphously quite quickly as the revolution unfolds. Okay, so you've got this middle group, these independents who don't necessarily align to one political view, which I suppose each side are vying for the support of in the speeches that they're making in the assembly, for when they vote on decisions of what they're going to do. Okay, so the stuff on the right is to the right hand side of the dotted line is to do with what make up the Jacobin the assembly deputies are, okay, in terms of their political views. But you can see on the left, out the other side of the dotted line, you've got another group, the Cordeliers Club and the Paris Mob, and they are in the same colour as the Jacobins and the Girondins, which we haven't talked about yet. They're going to come up a bit more later on, and that's because they've got the same view, really. Increasingly they're in a political alliance with each other in favour of that view. That view increasingly being get rid of the king and have republicanism. The reason they're not represented in the assembly is clearly, ordinary members of the Paris mob, or the sans-culottes as we increasingly call them, wouldn't have the opportunity to be. Remember the active versus passive citizens, remember the property qualification for different stages of elections, remember the fact that the Cordeliers Club has a very low entrance fee, so that is basically aimed at the passive citizens in the citizens of Paris. So they don't have representation in the assembly per se. It's through this alliance with the Jacobins that they have influence in the assembly, but also they have influence through, numbers, don't they? They have influence through the Paris mob and joining people together and popular action. So can you just make sure you've coloured in the different groups, if possible, and you've written down who is in these different groups, which is a little bit of a reminder because we have covered this before. So we know that Marat and Danton were the founders of the Cordeliers and that Desmoulins is there as well. We know that Robespierre is increasingly the spokesperson of the Jacobins. It's like an unofficial role. We haven't really talked about the Girondins yet. They are kind of like a part of the Jacobin Club that are particularly followers of a guy called Brissot. Okay, so at this moment in time, the Jacobins and the Girondins are on the same side. Later on, the divisions between them might open up as well. We're going to talk about the Feuillants in a minute, and the constitutional monarchists. We've got Lafayette there. We could also, if you wanted to add, put in Abbé Sieyès. You could have put in Mirabeau, but he's dead. Bailly, remember, he's mayor of Paris at this time. So we have some idea of these different political viewpoints already. Okay, so we know that on the 20th to the 21st of June, the flight to Varennes happened, which was when the monarchy tried to flee. And I think we know already that a few days later, on the 24th of June, 30,000 people marched to the National Assembly calling in support of the Cordeliers Club petition to put the king on trial. So you can add that to your version of this sheet. Now, clearly not everybody in the assembly is going to want that to happen. Some people do, but as you can see from the sort of percentages on the diagram there, they're not necessarily in the majority. So when they have a vote on the decision to suspend the king, this actually divides the assembly. So it wasn't a unanimous consensus view, and actually 290 of the deputies don't even vote, which shows how torn many people were and how sort of difficult a decision this was. So in response to the fact that they've decided to suspend the king until they can put him on trial, but they haven't decided to suspend the king until they've completed the constitution, but they haven't decided to put him on trial. As a response, the Cordeliers and the Jacobins joined together in a petition demanding his trial. Okay, and this alignment with the Cordeliers amongst the Jacobins is what creates another schism. So you've got the more moderate members, the Feuillants, actually leaving and setting up their own club, just like, literally about 1 minute walk down the road on Rue Saint-Honoré, right on the same road that Robespierre lives on in Paris, called the Feuillant Club. So you're getting more divisions opening up, aren't you, over the decision of what to do with Louis. And I think that's a key part of this, isn't it? The monarchies betrayed the people, they tried to flee to get foreign aid, and the question of what to do with the monarchy is opening up a can of worms in terms of what role are they going to play in the future constitution? Should you let them off? Should you keep them? Or should you, remove them altogether? Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at adding those to your sheet. If you need more time, do feel free to pause the video and do that. But we're going to move on to the next task. So we've got the background of these political divisions up to the 16th of July, a month after the flight to Varennes. And what I want to look at now is something called the Champ de Mars massacre. Okay, so on the 17th of July, which you might remember is the bicentenary of the revolution. The 14th of July would be the bicentenary of the revolution. So 3 days after that, 3 days after that, they have a demonstration at the Champ de Mars. Okay, so we're going to look at what happens at the Champ de Mars, which is this military field just on the outskirts of Paris, where they have this Fête de la Fédération every year, commemorating the events of the storming of the Bastille. And we're going to think about, does this worsen these divisions or heal them, and who ultimately comes out on top of this event? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is you're going to have a bit TV watching now. So can you click on this link, or you can cut and paste it from your worksheet into your browser. And it's a clip, it's about 10 minutes. It's just the film extract of the Champ de Mars massacre. And then on your worksheet, you've got a grid where I'd like you to colour code the information into 3 colours. Why the Champ de Mars happened, what actually happened, consequences, and why it was significant. And then underneath, can you try and think about who held the upper hand after this event? Did this event help or hinder the radical cause of removing the king? Who's in the ascendancy after this? So pause the video now and complete task 2 on your worksheet. Okay, so let's have a little look at some suggested answers. Now, arguably, some of these could be several different ones, particularly the bottom right one there, like, the fact that they've introduced the martial law could be suggested to be part of the event rather than impact or consequences. But it's all pretty similar in the end of the day. So we know that this happened because there was dissatisfaction amongst the working classes about the monarchy and this petition on the 24th of June. But there was also economic strife going on, and the price of bread and the decline in real wages and the kind of dislike of what is perceived to be kind of grain hoarding, that is a constant annoyance that's going on in the background for the working classes. And we know that had been kind of the spark for a lot of other popular action, like the storming of the Bastille, like the March of the Women to Versailles in the October days. So these economic conditions are another thing that is driving on the sans-culottes to do these events. Don't forget our famous quote, "I defy you to incite revolution on a full stomach." This is important in explaining why 50,000 people are willing to go and march on the Champ de Mars field for what is a political agenda. It's because it's got a real effect on, they perceive it has a real effect on their standard of living. They are desperate people. So this is organised by the Cordelier Club and other left-wing radical political clubs, that smaller ones that are less significant that existed at the time. And they go to the Champ de Mars field, and they have this petition which 6,000 of them sign. It's a Republican petition for which they sign on the altar of the fatherland, a large memorial commemorating the revolution. Now, Lafayette and the National Guard are dispatched by at this point moderate Paris Commune, because don't forget we've got Bailly in there, and the Assembly, who want to put down this protest. And they go there, they threaten them, they fire warning shots, but ultimately nothing is successful, as you saw in the video, and they shoot into the crowd. And 50, probably, we don't know exactly, unarmed protesters are killed. And hence this is why this is called in the radical press a massacre, because they were killed without having arms themselves. And the consequences of this, this illustrates the divisions that have emerged, doesn't it? So this is a clear demonstration that unity in the revolution is breaking down. The working class mob are no longer supporting the actions of the National Assembly. And that's going to be a key part in how constitutional monarchy is overthrown. And the actions of the National Guard and Lafayette, who's in charge of the National Guard, are really seen to be a betrayal of the people. So not only is the king betrayed the people, but now those politicians, those moderate politicians that are willing to work with this mistrustful king, are also betraying the revolution. So it doesn't get rid of radical demands to want to overthrow the monarchy, but it does. In some ways, those divisions are just worsened. But other people are much more in favour of the assembly, because these actions of the working class mob are frightening, aren't they? They've got huge numbers here. They're willing to, they won't disperse. They're throwing stones at armed guards. So moderate support from the provinces, particularly with richer people, is going to rally behind the assembly. And you could therefore view this as a kind of a win for the moderates, because after this, as it said, that support is rallying behind them, and martial law is introduced, and this means that 200 of the activists involved in this event were arrested, and lots of the other leading figures of the radical left, such as Desmoulins and Marat, had to go into hiding. Danton even ran away to England. This is at the point where Marat hides in the sewers and gets his horrible skin disease. So actually, in terms of influence, they're not having much influence, are they? If they've been if they're running away and they're not publishing their magazines and newspapers, and order has been restored. So in terms of the questions then, I'd say in the short term, the upper hand was held by the moderates, wasn't it? It was held by the moderates in the assembly. And in some ways, you could say that this event kind of hindered the radical left's cause, because they'd attempted to demand the overthrow of the king, and yet they'd been resisted, hadn't they? So when we're thinking about the failure of constitutional monarchy, something else is going to have to happen, isn't it? Some other involvement or factor is going to need to affect opinions in order to change that balance of power away from the moderates. That might be what we're doing next lesson. Okay, so coming back to our diagram, we can add some more information on here. And we can say that given the fact that the Jacobins were on the back foot now, they had ganged together with the Cordeliers to demand the removal of the king and the king be put on trial. You know, that they had been in favour of this march on the Champ de Mars. In the light of the fact that this had failed and actually support was moving away from them, what Robespierre does is he proposes something called a self-denying ordinance. And this is an idea that will come up in your British course again. It's the idea that politicians shouldn't be self-interested, and what they should do is actually allow free elections to take place. And what it would mean is that when this new legislative assembly, the new assembly under the new constitution, sat in 1791 or was elected in 1791 in September, that anybody that had been a member of the National Assembly, or the Estates General that had become the National Assembly, should be refused to take up their seat. Okay, they shouldn't be allowed to be re-elected, and therefore we would get a whole new group of politicians put into place, and all of these divisions which had emerged between these different personalities would be done away with. And this was successful. This was actually accepted. Okay, and we can also say that Louis accepted this new constitution, and you can add this on the box on the right hand side, and that when this new legislative assembly sat, it was pretty much made up entirely of bourgeois kind of individuals. Okay, so we're talking about, you know, lawyers, merchants, tradespeople, people with, you know, small businesses, very few nobles, and very few what we might, you know, clergymen from the First Estate. And we can explain this looking back at the voting structures of this new constitution that we've talked about previously. And actually, only less than 25% of the active citizens voted. So you're beginning to see in all this absenteeism from making a decision and choosing a side in all of this, these votes that are happening both in the assembly and elections, that actually, you know, many people are very worried about politics. You know, when people don't vote, it's sometimes apathy about, you know, they don't care and they don't think it matters who they vote for. But other times, like at tense periods like this, it can mean that, you know, that they worry about the outcome, or they really can't make a decision because there's no good choice to make. And I think it's more that that is the case in this situation. And of these members that are elected, half of them were under 30 years old. So they're not only are they, many of them, very new to politics, they're from lower down the social standing, they're very young, many of them. And that, you know, that's going to have an impact later on when we look at things like the terror and, you know, all these young men staying up late at night drinking. And that does have a bit of an impact on some of the radical policies that come about. So just looking at this thing about influence, again, you can add this to your sheet. We could say, if we wanted to put numbers on it in this, when the new legislative assembly is elected, we could say that most of those elected would have been in what we would call sort of non-aligned or independent. After that, the largest group of kind of aligned politicians would be faience and constitutional monarchists that have sort of joined together to be the more moderate side of the assembly. And in the minority are the Jacobins. Okay, and because of the self-denying ordinance, Robespierre is not amongst them himself. So coming back to our kind of, you know, our key thing about where does the balance of political power lie, you know, we said before that the flight to Varennes was going to be a turning point, and that was going to be desperately, you know, that was going to be like the nails in Louis's coffin, and this was going to be a really bad step in terms of keeping the monarchy in France. But so far, by, you know, September 1791, a couple of months later, that has not been proven to be the case. Louis has been almost given a reprieve, he's being given a second chance, because constitutional monarchists do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They want to keep a monarchy, they want to keep stability, they don't want to give way to the radical mob. So, you know, the influence of the flight to Varennes might need to be looked at in the longer term, and it will come back to haunt Louis later on. It has changed attitudes towards him, and it has created all these divisions, but certainly in the short term, republicanism has not won out yet. Something else, like I said, is going to need to happen for republicanism to be much more widely supported than it is in the sort of autumn of 1791. Okay, so thanks for attending the lesson. Can you make sure that you've done these 3 tasks that we've had on the worksheet and uploaded your assignment to Microsoft Teams? We're going to have a live lesson on Tuesday, the 2nd of February, period 5, so starting at 2:25, to think about this a little bit more, and also to look at, okay, what does change then between September 1791 and 92? What is it that ultimately sees the end of constitutional monarchy?